Montana Territory, October 1882. They buried Emmett Callahan on the first hard frost of the season, and by nightfall, the Cowboys were already saying his widow would not last the winter. "She will freeze or starve or run," one of them muttered by the fire, brushing snow off his saddle. "No woman stays up here alone with two little ones and no man." Willa Callahan heard it through the walls of the log house Emmett built with his own hands. She stood over the stove, feeding pine wood into the flames, her face tight with grief and stubbornness. She would not cry, not where her children could see. She turned to them, a boy of 7 and a girl just 5, their small hands wrapped around tin mugs of watered milk. "We're going to be just fine," she said, setting her jaw. The ranch sat 20 miles north of Red Lodge, nothing around but hills and pine and the sharp cut of wind. Willa had married Emmett at 18, moved from her father's farm in Missouri, and learned fast what it meant to be isolated. But Emmett had always been strong. Until the horse bucked and threw him on a pile of rock-hard earth, splitting his skull wide open. Now, she was 30 and alone, and the woods had already gone gray with winter. On the third day after the funeral, when the last of the hired men packed up, Willa stood on the porch and watched them ride off without a backward glance. She did not ask them to stay. She knew the ranch barely had enough to pay one man, let alone 4. She worked every hour. She chopped the wood, mended the fences, milked the cow, and taught her children their letters by firelight. When she bled from the palms, she wrapped them in cloth. When her back ached, she lay flat on the wooden floor and breathed. But by November, things were slipping. The snow came early and deep. One of the chickens froze. The stovepipe cracked and the barn roof leaked. And then the wolves came. They took 3 sheep in 2 nights, and Willa sat up with her rifle, her heart in her throat. She had not fired a shot since Emmett taught her to aim. She was down to half a barrel of flour and a quarter sack of beans when she rode into town. The mare was thin and limping, and Willa's boots were wrapped in burlap to keep out the cold. Red Lodge had grown since she last came. 2 more saloons, a new mercantile, and a telegraph office. But the men in the saloon still looked at her the same way, like she was something already dead. "You ought to take those kids and go back to Missouri," said a tall man with a whiskey voice. "Ain't no shame in quittin'." Willa did not answer. She only pulled the list from her coat and walked to the counter at the mercantile. "Ma'am," the storekeep said, eyeing the paper, you got money for all this?" "No," she said, "but I have this." She slid Emmett's old rifle across the counter. The man frowned. "This is a fine piece." "It is, and it is all I have." "Willa Callahan," a voice said behind her. She turned. He was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders, with cold dark hair and a beard that framed a strong jaw. His coat was worn at the edges, boots dusted with frost. But his eyes, those were the same, steady, kind, and sharp as broken glass. "Clint Hartley," she said, her voice catching. They had not spoken in over 12 years, not since she told him she was marrying Emmett. "You look cold," he said. "I am managing," she said. "You should not be out here alone." "I am not alone, I have my children." He looked down at her hands, red and cracked. "You cannot do this by yourself." "I can," she said. "I will." Clint was a cattleman now, owned land west of the river. He had ridden into town for salt and mule shoes, and now he stood looking at her like the past had never gone. "You still living up near Coyote Ridge?" he asked. She nodded. "That land gets cut off come January, you know that." "I know." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me help. I do not want your pity." "It is not pity." "Then why?" He hesitated. "Because I have not stopped thinking about you since the day you left." Willa felt something shift in her chest, something old and buried. She turned away. "I cannot think about that." "I can," Clint said, his voice low. "And I will." By the time she rode back to the ranch, there were 2 sacks of flour and a bag of oats tied to her saddle. Clint had followed at a distance, leading a mule piled with supplies. He stayed only long enough to check the barn and patch the roof. Then he left, promising to return in a week. And he did. Every week after that, he brought salt pork and fresh eggs, helped mend the fence and taught her boy, Caleb, how to throw a rope. He never asked for anything. Never pushed. He just came. Willa watched him with the children, strong hands gentle. She listened to the sound of his laugh in the cold air. She found herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch. "You smile more when he is here," said her daughter, Clara, one afternoon. Willa blinked. "Do I?" "Yes," Clara said, nodding. "And you do not cry at night anymore." Willa's heart clenched. She had not known they heard. One night in December, after the children were asleep, Clint stayed longer than usual. They sat by the fire, a pot of beans between them. "You are different," he said. "So are you," she replied. He looked into the flames. "When you married Emmett, I thought I would never come back here." "You left," she said. "I had to. I could not watch you love someone else." She was quiet. He looked at her then, really looked. "But I never stopped, not one day." She set her cup down with shaking hands. "Do not say that unless you mean it." "I mean every word." She looked at him, and this time she did not turn away. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to step back. She did not. Their lips met soft and sure, and something warm bloomed in Willa's chest that had not been there in a long, long time. She pulled back just enough to whisper, "I am scared." "I am not," he said. "Not when I am with you." And for the first time since Emmett died, Willa believed she might just make it after all. By late December, the wind bit harder, carrying needles of ice that scraped along the windows and found their way through every crack in the log walls. Willa had taken to stuffing sheep's wool between the chinks where the daub had thinned, and Clint brought her a length of canvas from his own stores to tack over the broken side of the door. He came just after dawn that morning, boots crusted with snow, leading a wagon piled with dry cut pine. Caleb opened the door before she could, wiping sleep from his eyes with the sleeve of his nightshirt. "You're early," Willa said, brushing her hands on her apron. Clint glanced toward the sky, low and heavy with cloud. "Storm's coming." "Thought I'd get here before it hits." She stepped aside, letting the warmth from the stove roll out across the porch. "You want coffee, I take it," he said, pulling off his gloves. Clint carried the wood in without being asked, stacking it near the hearth while she poured water into the kettle. Clara pressed close to his side as he crouched, her small fingers twisting around the fringe of his coat. "You smell like smoke," she said. He smiled, eyes crinkling. "That's 'cause I lit a fire before I left home. My mule don't like to start the day cold." Willa watched him over the rim of her cup, the way he listened when the children spoke, never pretending to understand more than he did. She'd seen men ignore children, or worse, talk at them like they were simple. Clint never did. After the snow began, thick and fast, he stayed that night. The wind howled against the eaves and the lantern flickered low. Willa laid her children down in the back room, tucking quilts tight around them. When she returned to the hearth, Clint had taken off his coat and was turning the kettle off the flame. "I'll sleep near the door," he said. "Keep it blocked in case the snow piles too high." She nodded, her hands still as she watched him spread his blanket on the floor. "You married?" she asked, voice quiet. "No." "Why not?" He poured the last of the coffee into his tin cup. "Didn't find the right one." Willa sat on the bench beside the stove, her feet tucked under her skirt. "You ever think about it still?" He looked at her, long and steady. "Only when I'm here." The kettle hissed between them. Willa wrapped her arms around herself. "You don't have to say things just to be kind," she said. "I don't," Clint answered. "I've worked cattle with men who lie easy. I'm not one of them." She stared into the flames, the silence stretching. At last, she said, I thought I was done with wanting. Clint didn't move. You're allowed to want again. They didn't speak the rest of the night, but when she rose to stir the fire before dawn, she found his coat draped over her shoulders. By New Year's, Clint had built a lean-to beside the barn, saying he needed a place to keep tools dry. Willa understood. He was giving her room to decide. One evening, after tying off the last section of a new fence line, they sat on the hill above the pasture. The sky was the color of blue glass, and the snow caught the dying light like crushed pearl. Your mother still in Missouri? Clint asked, brushing his gloves clean. She passed 2 springs ago, pneumonia. Clint gave a short nod. She was hard on me, Willa continued. Said I was too willful, too quick to run off with a dream. Did you? He asked. She looked out over the ranch. Maybe, but I didn't regret it, not even the hard parts. Clint leaned back on his elbows. I've always liked that about you. You don't scare easy, Willa laughed softly. I scare plenty, I just don't let it stop me. The sun dipped lower and Clint turned to her. I want to ask something. But I'll wait till you're ready. She met his eyes. You can ask, he hesitated. Would you let me stay, not just through winter, not as a helper, as yours? Willa felt her breath catch, not from shock, but from the way it settled so simply in her heart. No sweeping words. No promises carved from air, just a man who had come back and stayed. I would, she said. Clint reached for her hand, warm through the wool of her glove. Then I will. They sat like that until the last of the light vanished. The hills hushed beneath deep snow, and something new beginning in the silence between them. January settled in with a silence so deep, even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Snow stood waist-high along the fence lines, and the creek had frozen solid enough for Clint to walk across with a fresh-cut beam slung over one shoulder. He'd come to reinforce the lean-to, but Willa found him kneeling beside the back stoop, scraping the ice from the water trough with the blunt end of a hatchet, sleeves rolled, breath curling like smoke. She leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, eyes narrowed against the sun. You planning to work through supper again? Clint looked up, his beard frosted at the edges. Was hoping you'd make me stop. She stepped down into the snow, skirts brushing her boots. Then you're in luck. They ate by lamplight, the room dim and quiet. Caleb had gone to bed early, worn out from hauling wood, and Clara was curled in the rocker with her doll, drifting between sleep and a child's half-dream. Willa ladled soup into bowls, her hands steady now, no longer cracked raw from cold and labor. Clint broke a biscuit in half, passed it to her without a word. She took it, then glanced at him. You still ride out to your place much? Every Sunday, he said. Just to check the stock and make sure the windows haven't blown in. You ever miss it? He chewed slowly, then shook his head. Not like I thought I would. She sat back, tilting her face toward the lamp. I used to think I'd never be enough for this land, like it was waiting for me to give up. You didn't. No. She looked down at her hands. But I came close. Clint reached across the table, calloused fingers brushing hers. You held on. That counts. Willa swallowed, the weight of that truth settling in her chest. I want to do more than hold on. His hand stayed on hers, warm and certain. You already are. The next morning, Clint took Caleb with him to mend a section of fence that had caved under snowdrift. Willa stood at the window long after they were gone, watching the trail their boots had pressed into the white. She didn't know when she'd stopped waiting for the worst to come, but she had. Clara tugged at her sleeve. Mama, can I help bake today? Willa smiled. Get the flour tin. They worked side by side, the girl's hands dusted with white, her hair tied back in a crooked ribbon. The oven warmed the kitchen, and for a few hours the wind outside was just a sound distant and harmless. By noon, Clint and Caleb returned with windburnt cheeks and a bundle of kindling. Caleb ran ahead, shouting about a fox trail he'd followed, arms flailing with excitement. Clint stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. Fences holding for now. Willa handed him a cup of hot cider. You're spoiling him, just keeping his legs busy. He leaned against the counter, sipping slow. He's got his mother's fire. She raised an eyebrow. Is that what you think? I know it. That night, after the children had gone quiet, Willa sat by the fire, mending the elbow of Clint's shirt while he ran a whetstone down the edge of his knife. The rhythm of it was steady, comforting. She didn't look up. You ever think about building more here? Clint's hand paused. You mean barns? She folded the fabric once, twice. I mean staying. He set the knife aside. I thought you'd never ask. I'm not asking. Then I'm saying yes anyway. Willa stood, dusting thread from her skirt. She crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and rested her hand against his chest. You'd really trade your land for this? I'm not trading. I'm adding to it. She leaned in, forehead resting against his. Then let's build it together. He kissed her once, the way a man does when he's certain of the ground beneath him. And she kissed him back, not like a widow, but like a woman choosing her life with open eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside the house, there was only warmth. Not the kind that fades with morning, but the kind that lasts through every storm a hard world can throw. February came with a stretch of bitter nights and skies the color of pewter. The snow hardened to rutted crusts, winds sweeping low through the valley like they meant to scrape the land clean. But inside the Callahan house, the air stayed warm, and the days began to carry a rhythm that felt, to Willa, like a kind of beginning. Clint had moved into the lean-to fully now, though most mornings she found his tools stacked in neat rows beneath the porch eaves. His coat hung beside hers. He never assumed more than she offered, but he was there in the creak of the front gate he'd mended, in the way Clara's boots were always dry come morning, in the sigh Caleb let out when Clint nodded his way after a job well done. Willa stood at the table, slicing strips of dried apple for a pie. The knife moved easily in her hand, the task familiar. Clint leaned against the far wall, stripping the worn leather from a saddle he'd brought in to thaw. You ever hear from your brothers? He asked, not looking up. No, she said. They stayed east. One joined the railroad crews. The other was too set on never leaving Missouri to write letters. He rubbed a thumb along the saddle tree's edge. Do you miss them? I miss the idea of them more than the men they turned into. Clint gave a soft grunt. Not agreement, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. She glanced at him. You got family still living, 2 sisters in Helena. One married to a banker, the other runs a boarding house. I see them when I have to. Why only then? He hesitated, then said, they think cattle work's a waste. That I should have stayed back and done something with numbers. Willa dusted flour over the dough. You ever want that? I wanted sky. I wanted land I could walk without asking anyone's permission. She nodded, folding the crust over gently. That I understand. He looked up then, his eyes holding hers. This place, it feels like it's meant for something more, not just survival. She pressed the crust into the tin, careful not to tear it. You think about what that more looks like? I do, he said. Most days now. She didn't answer, but he didn't need her to. That afternoon, they took the sleigh down to the frozen creek. Clara wrapped in quilts in the back while Caleb helped Clint load broken limbs onto the runners. Willa walked beside them, her boots packed with straw and her scarf knotted tight under her chin. At the bend in the trail, they met a neighbor, old Mr. Dawes, bundled thick and leaning heavy on his mare. He tipped his hat to Willa, his face red from wind. Word's been getting around, he said, eyes flicking between her and Clint. Folks say you've made it farther than anyone thought. I heard what they said, Willa replied, steady. Well, Dawes said, shifting in his saddle, they're saying different now. She didn't ask what. She didn't need to. As they rode back, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the white. Willa tucked the blanket tighter around Clara, who had fallen asleep with her head against a sack of kindling. Clint watched her with a quiet that was more than silence. "You know," he said, "I used to think peace came when the work was done, but maybe it's when you stop trying to outrun the hard parts." Willa looked ahead, the path winding gently toward home. "Maybe peace is knowing you don't have to run alone." That night, after the children had gone to bed, Willa opened the chest that had sat untouched since the week of Emmett's funeral. Inside were folded shirts, a straight razor, and a small tin box of letters he'd written her the first year they married. She held one a moment, then set it aside. Clint watched from the doorway, his hands buried in his back pockets. "You sure?" he asked softly. "I am," she said, closing the lid. He walked over, kneeling beside her. "Not asking you to forget him." "I wouldn't want to," she said, "but I'm choosing what comes next." He reached up and brushed her hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "So am I." Willa leaned into him, her breath warm against his collarbone. "Then let's make a life worth remembering." And he kissed her there, not in haste or hunger, but with the solemn promise of a man who'd waited long enough to know what mattered. Outside, the snow fell again, soft this time, like it had changed its mind about scouring the earth. Inside, two hearts, once weathered and worn thin, began the slow, steady work of building something new. By the time March edged in, the snow began to shrink from the edges of the fence posts, and the first thin blades of grass peeked through the thawing ground around the barn. The days lengthened, slow but steady, and the sharpest bite in the wind gave way to the kind of cold that invited work instead of punishing it. Clint had started laying the foundation for a new addition to the house, a small room off the back, meant to hold tools and winter stores. Caleb helped him mix the lime for mortar, and Willa watched from the root cellar door, wiping her palms on her apron as she counted the last of the potatoes. "Your boy's got a good head for measuring," Clint said later, brushing dust from his sleeves as he stepped inside. "He's got your patience," Willa replied, setting a crock on the counter. "Emmett used to rush him." Clint pulled a stool out from the corner and sat. "You ever think you'd want more?" She turned, brows lifted. "More what?" He shifted, elbows on his knees. "Children. A bigger family." Willa leaned her hips against the counter, folding her arms. "I think about what I could give them now, not just warmth and food, but steadiness. I couldn't have said that before." He met her gaze. "I want that too, with you." She didn't speak right away. The stove ticked behind them, and outside, Clara's laughter rose in the yard as she chased a broken hoop across the mud. "I'm not afraid of starting again," she said. "But I needed to know I wasn't just filling space for you." Clint stood, crossing to her. "You're not. You never were." She took his hand, rough and warm, and placed it on the curve of her waist. "Then we can build whatever comes." That Sunday, they rode out to the small chapel near the edge of Red Lodge, whitewashed and quiet, with a split-rail fence and a bell that hadn't rung in months. The preacher, a man Willa had known since she was first married, met them at the door with a puzzled kind of smile. "Didn't think I'd see the two of you together," he said, wiping his spectacles. "You will again," Clint answered. The ceremony was simple, just the preacher, Willa, Clint, and the children, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the high-beamed ceiling. Clara wore a dress Willa had sewn from old muslin, and Caleb carried his father's Bible, its spine mended with glue and twine. There were no guests, no music, no gifts. But when Clint slid the plain gold band onto Willa's finger, her eyes shone in the dim light, and the air in the chapel felt like spring had already arrived. That night, back at the ranch, Willa stood by the window, watching the last of the snowmelt trickle down toward the pasture. Clint was behind her, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt as he banked the stove. "I used to think I was meant to live out my days surviving," she said, her voice low. "But I don't feel that anymore." He came to her, resting his hands at her hips. "You were meant to live, just took time to find where." She leaned into him. "I'm glad it was here." They spent the weeks that followed sowing seed along the south field, replacing the cracked slats in the chicken coop and preparing the ground for a new kitchen garden. Clint built a swing from a hickory limb for Clara, and Caleb took to riding bareback, hollering across the field with a joy that hadn't touched him in a year. Willa stitched curtains from old flour sacks, humming under her breath while the fire crackled and the scent of bread filled the house. In the evening, once the children were asleep, Clint would light the lantern and they'd sit side by side, sometimes speaking, sometimes only listening to the wind shift through the cottonwoods. One night, as she laid her head against his shoulder, she said, "I never thought I'd have peace again." He kissed the top of her head. "You didn't find it, you made it." Years passed. The ranch grew not large but enough. Another boy came the following spring, born strong and quiet, with Willa's eyes and Clint's steady hands. They named him Thomas, after Clint's grandfather, and he grew up with the rhythm of hammers and harvests, learning to walk between rows of beans and wildflowers. The house never changed much in size, but it grew full in the ways that mattered. Laughter, quiet affection, and the kind of love that didn't ask for proof. It lived in the way Clint brushed snow from Willa's shoulders without a word, or the way she pressed his coat against the stove early so it would be warm before he went out. They never left the land, never needed to. Folks came and went, seasons turned, but the Callahan place stood firm through it all, a quiet patch of earth where loss had once settled and love had taken root in its place. On warm summer nights, Willa walked the edge of the pasture with Clint's hand in hers, fireflies blinking between the tall grass, and the smell of pine heavy in the air. She'd glance over at him, his face lined by sun and time, and feel the same quiet certainty she'd felt the day she'd told him yes. And he would smile, not wide but content, and say, "Still glad you let me stay." She'd press her shoulder to his and answer, "Always." And she would mean it with every piece of her heart.